Have you ever driven down a familiar road and noticed a landmark that catches your eye? In the city, you know where you are by an intersection or your favorite stores and coffee shops. On country roads, however, things are a little different. When you're driving down a nameless road, you rely on natural landmarks like a unique tree or an old truck on the side of the road. For me, on the highway leading home, the landmark was an old stone windmill. It had stood in a field on the side of the road since I was a small child. In all those years, I had never once seen anyone working in those fields. Not a tractor tilling the land, not a lone farmer with droplets of sweat protruding on his forehead. I always assumed they were just abandoned and never bothered to ask about it. However, despite my lack of connections, I always noticed the lonely windmill whenever I passed it, a strange mystery that puzzles me to this day. The windmill was the subject of many rumors at my local elementary school. Stories and legends went round and round, each one even more unbelievable than the last. Some said it belonged to an old farmer who killed his family and then hanged himself from the rafters. Another version said the building was alive. If you've ever seen the old and rusty blades make a complete turn, it meant someone close to you had died. Eventually, the mystery became too appealing, and my friends and I decided to see if the rumors were true. Under the warm rays of the summer sun, we set off because none of us would dare to come at night. Every step towards the stone structure filled us with a strange sense of dread. The wind was perfectly still, as if even God feared the movement of its blades. We stepped into the shadow of the overhanging structure, and even the August heat couldn't stop the chill that ran down our spines. Just as I reached for the rotting door, a strong gust of wind came over us, and we heard the groan of ancient blades spinning. We all ran, keeping our metaphorical tails between our legs. As I entered adulthood and moved out of my country home, the windmill disappeared from my thoughts and memories. As real fears grew, such as bills and building a career, the imagined fears of youth seemed meaningless. That was until my father became ill and I had to return to his country home to visit him. The trip down the old deserted roads was like traveling back in time. As the sidewalk turned to dirt and the streetlights turned to the cold light of the full moon, I felt like I was leaving my adult life behind. I was that little boy again, looking out the window of the school bus. I felt joy and nostalgia until I saw a familiar landmark. A lone windmill protruded from the ground like a man-made mountain. With its stone base and metal blades gleaming in the moonlight, it looked the same as it always had. You'd think it would seem smaller in adulthood, but no, it still towered over me both figuratively and literally. It had been 17 years since I had laid eyes on it, but fear and awe of it enveloped me like a familiar mantle. Before I realized or knew what I was doing, I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. Questions swirled in my mind. Why was this windmill so appealing to me? Why did it catch my attention every time I drove past it? But the most important one was, why was I so afraid of it? Sure, as a child, the rumors and abandonment made it all seem scary, but why was I still so afraid after all these years? I knew I had to move on to see my father, but I also knew I had to settle the matter once and for all. The mystery of it all drew me in. It was worth it just to go inside, and the fear would fade away. All I would find was a dusty old windmill and a few empty cobwebs. Once I saw that, I was able to move on with my life and close that silly chapter forever. I returned to the car and grabbed my emergency flashlight. With a determined nod, I headed toward the dark shadows of the landmark. As I moved forward, I was taken back to when I was a child. I could feel the same terror overwhelming me. The mere thought of approaching this structure at night would have made the 10-year-old me hide under a blanket. By now, however, I was no longer a cowardly child, but a grown man who understood what the world was and what reality was. But if that was the case, why was I shaking so violently? I looked at the blades frozen in the moonlight and feared they were about to move. I felt like my spine was about to shiver. I shook my head, but not my body, and staggered forward. This had to end one way or another. I grasped the cold handle of the old wooden door and pushed it open. The creak of the broken hinges would have woken a dead man. Despite my best efforts to be brave, I could feel my heart pounding. Slowly but surely, I raised the flashlight to the door frame, and with a sense of relief, I saw exactly what I expected to see. There was an old rotting floor covered in dust, and in the corner lay a dirty cobweb with a lone spider sitting in the center of it. I grinned at my fear and was about to turn to leave when suddenly I heard a loud creak. I almost dropped the flashlight in surprise. Memories of running back to the road flashed through my mind, and all my instincts told me that this was what I should do. However, I was not a child and would not resort to fear and irrationality. I turned back and began to make my way inside, praying that the rotting floorboards would support my weight. I put my foot on the floor and heard it groan, but it held. I breathed a sigh of relief and began to light up the room. It was larger than it looked, but almost empty. There wasn't a single rat roaming the floor. Then what was that creaking sound? I asked myself. In response, the sound came from upstairs again. I slowly raised the flashlight until it fell on a pair of dead and empty eyes staring back at me. My blood ran cold. My instincts told me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead, I raised my hand, illuminating the old man's haggard face. My light also penetrated his arms, which were spread wide by 2 pieces of wood. His torso showed cuts that looked like relics etched into his skin. Legends of a hanged farmer flashed through my mind, but I knew it wasn't true. That old man would be nothing but bones and dust by now, and this body was fresh, maybe a few weeks old. I knew I had to call the police. This man's family deserved some peace. I lowered the flashlight to grab the phone, but at that moment, another foot showed at the other end of the room. I lifted it with a shaky hand and saw the dangling corpse of a young woman. Her body was fresher, probably only a few days old. I continued to shake, knowing and dreading what I was about to do next. I lifted my hand with effort and my jaw dropped as it rose. Hanging from the crossbar of the windmill were dozens of corpses in various stages of decomposition. All of the corpses had some unknown symbol carved into their stomachs. Slowly, almost in unison, the corpses swayed, and then it hit me. Inverted crosses were made in the shape of inverted crosses. I shone my light a little higher, and a blood-painted pentagram appeared on the ceiling above me. I felt like my roadside hamburger was about to burst when the stench of death reached me. How I didn't notice the stench when I walked in was beyond me. Maybe I didn't want to smell it. It was at that moment that I realized what horror was. Not fictitious childhood fear, not adult anxiety, but real terror without impurities. Every bone in my body turned to lead, my blood froze to ice, and my heart beat like a drum. In an instant, I was that 10-year-old boy again, and I ran out of the room as fast as I could. As I reached the field outside, I heard a sound that stopped me dead in my tracks. The blades of the windmill had come into motion. The creaking was almost deafening in the silence of the night. That was partly what was shocking. There was no wind at all. I directed my gaze toward the rusty, grinding sound. The blades slowly rotated 360 degrees and then stopped as if they hadn't moved at all. All rational thought had left my body, and all I wanted to do was get out of there. I jumped into the car and sped down the dirt road as fast as the car could go. Even after a few minutes, panic gripped me. I glanced in the rearview mirror now and then, half expecting the windmill to be about to rise over the hill like a giant lizard from a movie. Finally, as I turned onto the road leading to my father's house, I felt some relief. That was until I pulled into the driveway and saw my little sister standing on the porch crying. It turned out that my dad had passed away as recently as 15 minutes ago. If I had gotten there right away, I would have been there when it happened. Instead, My sister met my father's dying breath alone as he whispered about the winds blowing for him. I didn't get to say goodbye to my father, and that guilt would haunt me for the rest of my days. I told the police what I found at the Windmill, and they did a full investigation. The bodies were linked to several drifters and missing people in the area. They found bone fragments scattered everywhere and believe this has been going on for decades. They are looking for the killer, but doubt they will ever find him. If their lair is discovered, they'll just move on to another. After all, there are so many other abandoned buildings in the world, so many slumbering forests, and so many dark caves. How many sights do people see every day while traveling, always noticing them but never questioning them? What dark secrets might they hold?